So Tru, we're talking about Juneteenth, and first and foremost, I think it would be nice if you could just start with, what is it? Take us back so we can understand what Juneteenth is.
Absolutely, thank you, and thank you for having me. This is awesome. Juneteenth is a commemorative celebration of the emancipation of slaves. And I recognized on June 19th because on June 19th of 1865 is when the slaves in the furthest reaching parts of the slave states of the Confederacy finally got the message and finally got the word almost 2.5 years later, once the Emancipation Proclamation was issued, freeing the slaves, at least in the Confederate states, in what President Lincoln referred to as the rebel states and the rebellious states. That was a proclamation, essentially what we would call today an executive order, right, to free the slaves, that you can no longer hold slaves in the Confederate states. And so that was issued on January 1st of 1863. Now, it wasn't until June 19th of 1865 when General Granger finally reached one of the furthest reaching, most kind of westernmost regions of Texas, which was Galveston, Texas, where the word had not gotten out. Because the way that the slaves were actually freed is the Union troops were going to these Confederate states, going to these slave states, reading the proclamation, making the announcement, and enforcing compliance of this proclamation. Simply because it was issued, the Confederate states or the slave states were not necessarily complying on their own. So Union troops were now being deployed to ensure compliance. And what's interesting is a lot of the Confederate states, because they knew the Union troops were on their way, they were moving further west in the state of Texas to be in those farther and more remote locations. And then finally, June 19th of 1865, General Granger and his troops reached Galveston, Texas, and spread the word, read the proclamation that they were free, and it was cause for celebration.
Wow. So when did people actually start celebrating it, and has it been celebrated in Black communities throughout this country since then, or when did that start?
It started then with those that were freed, right? So it started back then of the celebration of the Emancipation, or Freedom Day, Emancipation Day as it was often called. So it started then. And then as those former slaves began to migrate to different parts of the country, they carry that memory and that celebration with them. So it began to gradually spread across the country as these former slaves migrated to different parts of the country, many of them heading north, where they felt as though there would be more welcoming circumstances and environments and climates for them, because there were still a lot of challenges and issues in the South, even if you were a freed slave. And so those celebrations went with them. And so it's been something that's been celebrated on a small scale for generations. And in more recent years, we're starting to notice more and more states that are celebrating, acknowledging, and recognizing Juneteenth, simply because they're just becoming more aware.
So now that people are becoming more aware, why is it important for people to have this conversation around Juneteenth in this country, and even to simply recognize it?
So that we can understand the true history, and we can understand that we all have different life experiences, we all have different lived experiences, and we all have different perspectives on how we view race and race relations. And if we are ultimately going to achieve the ideals of one nation with liberty and justice for all, it's important that we have an understanding of what that truly means from a historical perspective. So if we look at 4th of July, Independence Day, any American would tell you why it's important to celebrate that, because we received our independence as a nation. That was the birth of America, the birth of our nation, because we received our independence from England, right? And that is cause for celebration. There are tremendous celebrations every year. I mean, people are planning, the fireworks, the flags, very patriotic. Now, the reason that I think it's important we understand the history and celebrating Juneteenth is as significant is because if we are celebrating the freedom of America, which is comprised of Americans, is essentially what we are celebrating, the freedom of Americans. July 4th, 1776 did not ensure freedom of all Americans. It was not until June 19th of 1865, technically December of 1865, when the 13th Amendment was ratified, that all Americans were free. So June 19th should be cause for celebration for all Americans, because that is when all Americans truly received their freedom.
So as the possibility of June 19th moves towards being a federal holiday, first, what are ways that people can teach this to people throughout the country and in schools, and encourage people to understand why it's important? And secondly, can this conversation help heal the country from where we're at right now?
I think the conversation can help heal the country. I do believe that the more we are educated, the more we are able to empathize with other people's perspectives, situations, and circumstances. And so the more I understand your story, the more I learn about your experiences, then the more I can understand how you feel about a certain situation or circumstance, and race relations in this case. But more importantly than how you feel, I can now understand why you feel the way that you do. So there are people who, if you look at the contrast between the 4th of July and Juneteenth, there are people that will be critical of African Americans who celebrate the 4th of July. There are people who will be critical of African Americans who celebrate Juneteenth, right? And not the 4th of July. And so it's about having an understanding of not only how you feel about race relations in this country, but why you feel the way that you do. I don't need to agree with you or need you to agree with me, but once I understand your story and why, the operative word is why, right? Once we have clarity of purpose and understanding why people feel a certain way, now I can have that cognitive empathy, that emotional empathy, that compassionate empathy to say, oh, wow, I never knew that, I never understood it that way. And I think that can help bring us together. So it's really taking the time to educate. When the holiday first began to be celebrated, when they first started celebrating, some of the activities were to just read the Emancipation Proclamation, to tell stories and narratives of African American icons and their perspectives on things, to help educate all people as to who we are and how we got to where we are.
And for people who believe that, why do we have to go back, and why do we have to kind of relive that pain, or why can't we just move forward? And I wasn't a slave owner. There's a conversation around that. What do you say to them?
No, because as the quote goes, right? If we don't know our history, we're doomed to repeat it. And I think we don't live in the past, but we do need to learn from the past. And so it's because we can take so many valuable lessons of what we shouldn't do, so many valuable lessons of how to change behavior, which can shift culture and change culture. And so it's important that we understand some of the missteps of our forefathers. So I would suggest that, yes, none of us were there. None of us. So none of us were there when the Revolutionary War took place for us to gain our freedom as a nation, but we still celebrate Independence Day. So my suggestion to those who would say that, we can say that about any historical moment, right? That was before our time. None of us were there, but we still benefit or experience adversity because of the choices and decisions that were made from generations past.
Did the death of George Floyd and the social justice movement that went behind that, is that help moving this conversation, do you believe, around Juneteenth?
Absolutely. Based on my experiences in a lot of the organizations that I've spoken to and talked to across the country, it's been a bit of a revelation for them, and to recognize that, wow, there are some injustices and some inequities that exist in this country that can no longer be ignored. I think prior to that, unfortunately, there were a lot of people in positions of power and influence in a lot of organizations, institutions, and franchises that did not believe, or at least did not want to believe, that racism still exists, social injustice still exists, inequities across race and gender and sexual orientation, that these things are real and exist. And so specific to race, I think the incident of George Floyd, of seeing that, visibly seeing that play out, I think really served as a bit of a revelation to a lot of people in positions of leadership that, wow, this is real. And if we don't acknowledge it and address it, then we're complicit.
What would your hope for it to be one day, that Juneteenth would be something that would be in school books across the country, a conversation that's normal, or something that just everyone knows what it is and we don't even necessarily have to have the what is it conversation?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. I think the more that we can normalize the parts of our history that are hurtful or painful, maybe shameful and embarrassing, the more that we can normalize those conversations, the better equipped we are to identify the right solutions and resolutions and reconciliation that is necessary for us to heal as a country. I think when we are dismissive of other people's experiences, hurt and pain, then that creates a more of a divide in our ability to come together, because you're saying my feelings aren't valid, my experiences aren't valid, my trauma is not real. And that is hurtful and divisive in and of itself. So the more that we can have these open and candid conversations about historical moments like Juneteenth, I think it empowers us to now be able to co-create and collaborate on ideas and solutions on how we can all best coexist moving forward.